So, good morning to everyone joining us today from Asia, and good evening to our friends in Washington. Welcome to today's book launch event titled The Future of U.S. Commitment in Southeast Asia, The Outlook Under Biden and Beyond. I am Clarice Tacanay, Program Manager for Stratbase ADR Institute, your host and moderator for today's event. A few reminders before we start. The event is being recorded and will be made available through our website. We are also live on Facebook right now. And for any questions that our participants want to ask our speakers for today, kindly utilize the Q&A function you can see below your screens, and we will be bringing these up for the open forum. To begin our program, we have Professor Dingdong Manhit, President of Stratbase ADR Institute. With his extensive career, he has helped businesses, organizations, and major stakeholders understand the interplay between business and government and the impact of legislative, regulatory, and electoral outcomes. He also provides top-level strategic analysis and thought leadership on global issues here in the Philippines. Professor Dingdong Manhit.
Thank you, Clarice. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our friends from Washington, D.C. But welcome also to our participants. I think we have a little over 100 registrations. And also our friends from media, both local and foreign, have reached out to me to be part of this book launch of the future of U.S. commitment in Southeast Asia, the outlook under the Biden and beyond. We are happy to host this book launch, our good friend, Dr. Prashant. And it reminds me of our project currently happening in the Philippines, whereby we're trying to come up with different chapters, part of a book that will reflect, hopefully, strategic policy initiatives coming from thought leaders in the Philippines. You know, the Philippines needs to develop a more responsive and strategic foreign policy. We've all argued, and we've seen it in public opinion data, how fostering multilateral strategic partnerships is imperative if the Philippines is to recover from the consequences of 5.5 years of foreign policy decisions. But the public support this, and they support the need to align with a global alliance advancing free and open Indo-Pacific that shares the shared value, that shares values important to the Filipino people: rule-based international system, democratic values. And when you see a book like the one authored by Dr. Prashant, it becomes a good learning tool, learning source. And I took note of this line: calibrating and sustaining U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia is likely to prove challenging. Overcoming commitment imbalances will require not only changes to how Washington approaches Southeast Asia. That's what we need really in the Philippines, for Washington, for our partner, for our allies, to understand the uniqueness of our region, Southeast Asia, East Asia, or the Indo-Pacific region. We have seen, and we have emphasized this in our institute, the growing military power of China. And for a small country like the Philippines, we've always argued that we need to utilize our expansive network in securing the freedom of the seas to counter aggressive behavior from China's maritime militia, the gray zone, the hybrid warfare, informal warfare. More than 8 out of 10 Filipinos would like us to build alliances. More than 8 out of 10 Filipinos, as of the eve of the start of the campaign, would like us to modernize our own Coast Guard, our own Navy, so we can defend our territorial integrity and national sovereignty. We hope to learn from this book that we are launching, because as we enter the last few weeks of the 2022 elections in the Philippines, we always look at it from our institute that it can provide an opportunity for Filipino people to elect leaders who will prioritize the country's strategic interests, and actively pursue multilateral and inclusive cooperation with like-minded states. The United States continues to lead those countries with Japan, Australia, India, and the EU. The past few weeks, we have been focused on coming up with at least 5 policy papers that we will launch as part of our book Beyond the Crisis, a strategic agenda for the next president. And we're happy to share that moving forward. But my last point is I welcome you again in this book launch. For Filipinos listening in, for friends in Washington, D.C. From our institute, we believe there's a need to build a responsive and strategic Philippine foreign security policy. And books and learning tools like what we are launching this evening in Washington, D.C., this morning in the Philippines. It's very relevant at this time with what's happening around us. Again, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Dindo, thank you for your kind remarks and bringing us together this morning. I'd like to use this opportunity to congratulate my colleague, Prashant, on his newly released book, Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy. And a word about my friend Prashant as we start, if I may. He's a very serious policy person, an American originally from Malaysia who grew up in Manila. In fact, I met his father, who we affectionately call Param, a legendary Asia-focused journalist, nearly 30 years ago, right there in Manila, when he was the bureau chief for AFP. And he covered a press conference at Malacanang Palace when I was leading a US ASEAN Business Council delegation to the country. And we've been in touch ever since. So you'll see, Prashant was born into concise writing. He knows his stuff. He's worked with me and Murray Hebert to build the first ever Southeast Asia chair in a major Washington think tank at CSIS. And now he's helping support us and our clients at Bauer Group Asia as our deputy head of research. His writing is sharp, to the point, easy to read, and his views are not simply of an academic, but that of a practitioner as well. Prashant's book could hardly have come at a more important time as the Biden administration is grappling, trying to figure out its new relationship with Southeast Asia. And this is a work that's still very much in progress. As we've seen last week, the Biden administration finally hosted the Prime Minister of Singapore, the first Southeast Asian leader to visit since Mr. Biden was inaugurated. Also last week, China hosted the foreign ministers of 4 Southeast Asian countries, including the Foreign Secretary of the Philippines, reminding Washington that the hearts and minds of our friends in Southeast Asia have other suitors than just beyond the United States. Many of us believe the Biden administration has been a bit slow in its engagement with Southeast Asia. Although it has announced an Indo-Pacific strategy and a related Indo-Pacific economic framework, we still know very little about the economic components which are most important to this region. Plans to host the leaders of the ASEAN countries last week fell through, although the United States and Southeast Asian governments are trying to reschedule that summit in May. The US also doesn't have an ambassador to ASEAN. It hasn't had one since the end of the Obama administration, nor are there ambassadors named for Manila and Bangkok, the capitals of our 2 treaty allies in the region in Southeast Asia. So Prashant's book is well-timed and should be mandatory reading for officials, scholars, executives concerned about the ASEAN-US relationship. He provides a helpful overview of US relations with the region from the withdrawal after the Vietnam War through the rebalance to Asia under Obama. Prashant does this skillfully within the backdrop of a rising, more active China. Prashant provides a helpful analysis of how the US faces challenges translating the importance of ASEAN to Washington into concrete commitments and actions amid the other global commitments, which seem to rise up, like Putin's invasion of his neighbor Ukraine has done recently, and pull the White House's attention in other directions. Congratulations again, Prashant, for writing a timely and very important book. I look forward to the discussion between you and another friend of ours and my colleague, Jim Caruso. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ernie Bauer. He is the president and CEO of Bauer Group Asia. Thank you for the opening remarks. And again, thank you, Professor Dindo Manhit, for welcoming the participants of this program. To begin the formal part of our event today, we have Dr. Prashant Parameswaran. He is the author of the Elusive Balances Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy, the book we will be discussing for today. He is again the Deputy Head of Research for BGA, Fellow for the Wilson Center of Asia Program, and Senior Columnist for The Diplomat. Dr. Prashant.
Great. Thank you, Clarice. Thank you to Dindo and the team for hosting this and bringing us all together. And thank you to Ernie and to Jim as well. And I see a couple of people in the audience as well, including Murray Hebert, all of whom I learned a lot on Southeast Asia and Asia in general, and still continue to learn from as well. So I'm looking forward mostly to the discussion that we're going to have today, but I'll say a little bit about the book and what motivated me to write it, what this says about the Biden administration, and how I see sort of US policy evolving in that context. As Ernie mentioned in his remarks, this is still very much a work in progress for the Biden administration. And as Dindo mentioned, this is still occurring in a context where it's not just the United States that's adjusting its posture. It's also different Southeast Asian governments and publics that are also adjusting how they're approaching domestic politics and also foreign policy. And that's kind of where the book is situated. So just a little bit of a reason why I wrote this book. It's sort of a question that has sort of dogged me for a couple of decades now, looking at US policy in the region and looking at Southeast Asia more generally, which is that we keep essentially having the same conversation, which is essentially, why is it so difficult for the United States and for US administrations to sustain higher levels of commitment to Southeast Asia that matches Southeast Asia's rising profile in the region and then also globally? What we've seen in the past 30 years essentially is that Southeast Asia has gotten bigger on the map. I think if the last 2 decades is anything, the big story is not that the United States has pivoted to Southeast Asia. It's really that everyone really is pivoting to Southeast Asia. Japan is doing more, Australia is doing more, even some of the European countries are doing more as well. And that's a recognition, first and foremost, of Southeast Asia and the region. But for the United States itself, I think we've seen some administrations that have been very committed to Southeast Asia, like the Obama administration, for instance. But other administrations have had challenges in sustaining that commitment. We saw some of those issues under the Trump administration, which raised a whole host of issues with respect to US foreign policy. And we saw that a little bit as well, going a little bit back further with the George W. Bush administration, where there were some significant gains, the first signing of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, for example, the first in Asia, but that was overshadowed by a focus on counterterrorism after the September 11 attacks that made it seem like US policy was overly securitized. Now, the main departure point of the book is that these issues and concerns with US commitment to Southeast Asia are not new. In fact, if you look at the series of reservations that Southeast Asian countries have had, and even if you look at former US officials and what they've said about US policy, it's essentially the same question, which is, why is it so difficult for us to maintain not just a higher level of commitment, but also a balanced nature of commitment, one that is focused not just on security, but is focused on economics, it's focused on education, it's focused on people-to-people ties, education exchanges, so on and so forth. That's essentially the big question. And the argument that the book makes is that this is not something of the case where, Southeast Asia, for example, is a really difficult region to manage. It's extremely diverse. Absolutely, this is a region that is very diverse, but the United States has had more success in engaging in other regions as well that are diverse, right? Latin America, for example, Europe, for example, the Middle East, where U.S. stakes are actually decreasing over time. The United States is committed, and some would say overcommitted. Nor is it the case that this is a case of US policymakers just simply not making declarations that they want to keep. I think there is a recognition by US policymakers that this is a challenge. I think if you talk to the Biden administration folks now, they're very aware that this commitment challenge persists in Southeast Asia. They're very aware that the Indo-Pacific economic framework is not something that will substitute for the US withdrawal from TPP. But nonetheless, this is a structural problem with the United States. And I think that's where the book sort of tries to make the argument. And the argument that's made in the book, the reason why it's called Elusive Balances, the balances part is because the United States, essentially the book's main argument is that the United States has to face two sets of balances for US policymakers that makes it extremely challenging. One set of balances is at home, where the United States has to essentially not only think about its power position in the world, the distribution of power. In the current context, it's a sort of bipolar configuration, some would argue, between the United States and China. But if you look at the Cold War, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. You look at the end of the Cold War, it was a sort of more unipolar world. So power is one variable. But there's two other variables that are really important for the United States, and that's where I think the book tries to make a contribution. One is threats. And these are threats that not only are threats and challenges in the region, in Southeast Asia, but there are threats regionally and globally as well. This is particularly important when we look at issues like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The big challenge for US policymakers is, what is the hierarchy of threats and challenges that they face, and how do they sequence it? And how do they find the bandwidth to manage all of these threats, manage all of these challenges? And I think very often we find, we saw that I mentioned earlier with the George W. Bush administration after the September 11 attacks. We saw this in the Vietnam War, where communism essentially consumed US policymakers, such that the United States was overcommitted with respect to the Vietnam War and subsequently had to withdraw. And that resulted in a huge issue for US commitment to the region for several years to come thereafter in the post-Vietnam War withdrawal period. So that's one variable. The second variable that's really important, so I mentioned power, I mentioned threats. The other one is sort of state capacity and resourcing. This is a particular problem when we talk about, Ernie mentioned in his opening remarks, the Indo-Pacific economic framework and sort of the issue of economic commitments to the region more generally. The big issue for the United States is that it's now, in the present moment, competing with China, which is a much more state-centered economy, where the relationship between the government and the private sector is much more, it's closer, and it's also much more direct and much more coordinated. In the US policy context, that's not the case. The US government is one entity. The US private sector has a relationship with the government, but sometimes operates independently. And there are a whole number of other associations, NGOs, and nonprofits that do a lot for US Southeast Asia relations as well, but they remain quite apart from the government. And some of them want it to remain that way. So it's a big challenge for the United States to kind of compete in this model of commitment with gathering all of the resourcing that's required. And this has been a challenge throughout the period, in the post-Vietnam War period, where the United States, in some cases, there's congressional deadlock and they're unable to get their act together. In some other cases, in the post-global financial crisis period, the United States found itself, the Obama administration was promoting a pivot or rebalance to Asia, but it was doing so in the context of the post-global financial crisis period, where obviously resources were quite constrained. And so what you had eventually was the pivot and the rebalance was successful on some counts, but on other measures with respect to resourcing, there were public reports, including those released by Congress, that found that there was a huge resourcing shortfall by the United States when it was operating in Southeast Asia. So that's essentially the book's argument. The book looks at four case studies from the end of the Vietnam War up to the present. One is the sort of post-Vietnam War period, where the United States and U.S. policymakers, and this is actually a really interesting period because you can actually have access to the declassified documents of the period, and what you see repeatedly, U.S. officials, including the former president Richard Nixon, were essentially, their big challenge was reassuring Southeast Asian states that the United States was committed in spite of the fact that it was withdrawing from the Vietnam War. And one of Richard Nixon's sort of famous quotes, just to sort of paraphrase it, was essentially, you know, the big question and the big challenge, he said, was the United States knew that it couldn't meet its commitments, but it needed to make sure that China and the Soviet Union believed that the United States could meet its commitments. And so that sort of a gap between credibility and perceptions and reality is something that I think we can apply a little bit to the Biden administration today, when I think Biden administration officials know they're operating in a period of constraint, but they still understand that they need to do something to prove the fact that the United States is actually a force in the region. The second period looks at the sort of post-Cold War period, the end of the Cold War. And why this is interesting is, you know, as the former Singapore Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong sort of said and summarized with respect to US policy and lamented, the sort of threat of the Soviet Union, the challenge of the Soviet Union, was that it disciplined US policymakers to focus on Southeast Asia from that single prism of the Soviet threat. But without that, it became very difficult for the United States to actually focus on Southeast Asia for its own sake. So you saw a lot of priorities that were advanced, so multilateralism, democracy, a lot of bigger priorities that US policymakers had the sort of liberty and freedom to pursue that otherwise, in a context in competition with the Soviet Union, they would have found a little bit difficult to pursue all of those objectives simultaneously. And so that period serves as a really interesting period to remind us that it's a problem when, and a challenge when the United States has a peer competitor, because the United States will view Southeast Asia through that prism. But at the same time, without a major challenge or competitor, the United States will find it really hard to focus on a particular set of priorities as well. And the other two cases I've sort of talked about already, and so I don't want to dwell too much on them, but the post 9/11 period, post September 11 period, is a good example of the notion of the threat of terrorism consuming US policymakers and US policy, such that, you know, there were a lot of good things actually that happened with respect to individual bilateral relationships under the Bush administration. But I think unfortunately still, even till today, the Bush administration officials that I interviewed still lamented the fact that this was overshadowed by a lot of perceptions in the region about what US policy was about, both in Southeast Asia as well as at home. The sort of documentation of torture and human rights violations in the post 9/11 period, while the Bush administration was promoting a democracy agenda abroad, for example, is just one case in point. And then the Obama administration, I think, is a case in point about the resourcing challenge, where you had an administration that was very well intentioned, was focused on Southeast Asia, a president that was, you know, as one Southeast Asian former official that I interviewed said, you know, it's as good as it gets for Southeast Asia. You know, somebody who's spent time in the region, who's committed to the region, understands that even though the US has interest in Southeast Asia for its own sake, there needs to be a narrative around Southeast Asia for its own self and its own development in the region. So, but nonetheless, you still had issues, you still had challenges. When China was being more assertive in the South China Sea, the Obama administration was seen to be a little wanting in its response, even though there were some in the Obama administration who were agitating for a more active response. And the same thing with resourcing. I think there were a lot of initiatives, and Jim actually can probably speak very authoritatively to this, as well as other periods in US policy, where there were actually really good, well-intentioned initiatives, but they just never took off the ground. And now you're seeing the Biden administration try some of these initiatives again in that regard. So I'll just end quickly with just a few minutes on the Biden administration and kind of where it is today. I would say the Biden administration sort of finds itself in a very kind of interesting period where the United States it's very clear, at least here in Washington, that the threat perception with respect to the United States and China and what it's doing in the region is extremely high. And that's explains partly why the Trump administration, the inheritance to the Biden administration has found it very difficult to unwind some of the harsh policies that the Trump administration implemented with respect to China. But the big issue there is the resourcing challenge still remains. There are huge state capacity challenges for the United States in the context of COVID-19. The Biden administration is very consumed by domestic challenges. And in fact, parts of its domestic agenda still haven't been implemented. And it's looking at midterms towards the end of this year that's going to consume it as well. So you have individuals like Kurt Campbell, for example, who are very, very familiar and have written actually extensively publicly about what the challenges are for US in the region and also in Southeast Asia. They know what needs to be done. But I think it's a big challenge to actually implement all of this. So I would just say, I mean, the implications for what this means for the Biden administration and the future of US policy is such that, sustaining increased commitments to the region is not easy. A lot of the low-hanging fruit actually was picked in the Obama administration. So regular attendance at summits, for example, the United States signing agreements like EDCA with like-minded partners. And a lot of the harder things actually are what the Biden administration is left with. So convening a US ASEAN summit or failing to convene a US ASEAN summit would have seemed like a high bar maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But this is a context where that's not the case today. It's also the case that the Biden administration is trying to find its own feet with respect to working with allies and partners. There's this notion of like-minded allies and like-minded partners that the Biden administration has sort of talked about. The issue in Southeast Asia, though, is that there are a lot of unlike-minded or not so like-minded partners. And that's actually where the challenge for US policy is. It's with working with Cambodia, with Laos, a lot of these countries that are very vulnerable to Chinese influence, not necessarily just Singapore or even the Philippines, where there's actually, there are limitations obviously to any partnership, but there's actually a foundational element to it. And there's a lot of progress that's been made. So that's another challenge that's really difficult to sustain. And I think we can't ignore the fact that under the Biden administration, there's huge issues and challenges that individuals in Southeast Asia, if you look at the opinion surveys that are conducted by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, China is already seen not just as the big and the number one economic player in Southeast Asia, it's seen as the number one political and strategic player already. That might not be the case. The United States, has a huge security presence in Southeast Asia, and you wouldn't want to compare that with what China is doing. But perceptions sometimes can be reality in Southeast Asia. And so that perception gap remains to be seen and remains to be managed. And of course, I think the two other things that I mentioned earlier still remain. There's, threat perceptions that the Biden administration needs to manage. The United States is in a competition with China. It's very clear. But some countries in Southeast Asia, and in fact, all of the countries in Southeast Asia want to have some sort of relationship with China for the sake of coexistence. And on resource constraints, that's something where if the Biden administration finds itself challenged in terms of the resources it has to turn to allies and partners, and it has to turn to the private sector and NGOs to come up with that. But it's challenging again, because as I said earlier, the story is not that the United States has pivoted to Southeast Asia. The story is that many countries have pivoted to Southeast Asia. So when the United States says we're going to work with allies to do X, Y, and Z, what it would have said 15 years ago, the question I hear a lot from Southeast Asian countries is, no, we already know what Japan is doing. We already know what Australia is doing. We want to know, what is the United States doing? And what is your value add? And what can you bring to the table that's unique in that regard? And that's a question that they're asking of all their partners, but it's certainly a question that the United States is not going to be immune from. And you're seeing the Biden administration be creative about this. I think there are sectoral areas where the United States is looking to make inroads on climate, for example, on digital, and some other areas that the Biden administration has considered in the Indo-Pacific economic framework, like infrastructure. But again, these are not without challenges, right? I think Southeast Asian countries are very aware that on climate, for example, you have one administration that comes in, seeks a forward-leaning posture on climate, and then you have another administration that comes in and pulls back. And so the big question is really the time horizon question. If you look at the Biden administration, you can admire some of first steps that they're taking, but Southeast Asian countries will be looking to the midterm elections. They'll be looking to 2024 to see how will this sustain. And that goes back to the theme of the book, which is, balances is one part of it, but the other part of it is the elusive part. It's really tough for any administration to get the balance right domestically between power, threats, and resourcing. And then in the region, which is the other part of the balance for the Biden administration, it's really tough to get the balance right between economics and security, between interests and ideals, right? Between multilateralism and bilateralism. Southeast Asian countries want the United States to find that balance, and that balance is really difficult to strike with 10 countries in ASEAN and 11 countries in Southeast Asia. So I suspect it'll be a very interesting few months and few years that as we see the Biden administration evolve its approach to Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Prashant, for the overview of your book. I will be bringing up my question later about the hierarchy of threats and the prioritization of the US when it comes to its global role. To give his insights and his comments on Prashant's books and arguments is James Caruso. He is the Senior Advisor for Bauer Group Asia. He is also currently holding the position for the Chair of Australia for CSIS. He has been at the forefront of economic diplomacy in the Asia Pacific for much of his career, having previously served as a Senior Foreign Policy Advisor for the US Indo-PACOM in Hawaii. And he also served as a Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Australia and the US mission to the ASEAN back in mid-2019. So without further ado, Jim.
Thank you, Clarice. And Prashant, I wish I could speak half as clearly and beautifully as you do. That's your thoughts are really well expressed. I'll do what I can. I think there are a few things to keep in mind when you're sitting in Washington on the 7th floor. And one of them is Southeast Asia is just one region of the entire globe. And every country, every bureau is fighting for the attention of Washington. And because the State Department is a bureaucracy with a very strict hierarchy like the military, a lot of decisions are only made at the very top, and there are only so many brain cells and time in the day that a Secretary of State, much less a president, can devote to any particular issue. And the result is very often, as you know, crises get the attention, and that tending the garden of relationships or really plotting out a thoughtful way forward that is bilateral in nature rather than theoretical in nature is more difficult. I'll give you an example. So we signed a free trade agreement with Singapore quite a while ago now. And the idea was this was going to be the first free trade agreement of several in the region that would bind our countries more closely together because we saw trade as a global good and something that would lift countries up the economic ladder. Well, after Singapore, we went to Thailand and we negotiated there. And we didn't get very far, and then there was a coup. So we stopped the negotiations with Thailand, and they never resumed because the coups never really went away. But this is where, as Prashant, you were saying, our ideals, our policies, how we weigh each issue is not only a difficult decision, but a moving target, not even between administrations, but sometimes even within the administration. So one of the things I always encouraged country partners to do was, if you tell Washington what your priorities are, that actually is very helpful Because if everything is seen in Washington from the Washington prism, they don't really understand what's needed from the partner country's point of view, it's very difficult. And so a lot of misunderstandings result. Another example, in Indonesia, there was a lot of discussion about increasing the economic relationship, as it should be. It's really pretty thin given the size of the two countries. And there were groups put together of business people, of government officials, but it never went anywhere. And never went anywhere because, frankly, Indonesia has a very difficult business environment, A, and B, there was an expectation that somehow the government in Washington could just instruct business to invest certain places. And as we know, it doesn't work that way. So clear misunderstandings, clear differentiation in priorities. So what do we do next? Now, the pressure from China, especially against countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, because of the South China Sea issue, should be an area where there's greater cooperation between the US and, say, the Philippines to understand what's the nature of the threat and what do we do about it. And I know militarily to militarily, there's a lot of discussion, but it's always the same dance about, well, how far do we go? How far do we commit? We don't want to entice China to feel threatened and act out. How do we bring in partners, other partners in the region who may not want to participate in this sort of problem? So for instance, within ASEAN, where Laos and Cambodia certainly have no interest in creating a apparent anti-China coalition. So these are all issues that are being wrestled with in Washington. And I hope people in the region, Prasad, read your book so they have an understanding of these balance issues and maybe can engage better with Washington on how to help Washington appreciate what balance looks from a Southeast Asian point of view. And I'll stop there and have you talk more.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Prashant. We will be moving forward with our open forum and moderated discussion. To begin with, out of my own curiosity, you both mentioned something about prioritization of US policy in terms of crisis. So at the current times, we are facing the Ukraine crisis, and from the way the region is seeing it is US priority is moving towards the European region. But also there are talks about the similarity of the Ukraine crisis to what is happening with China in terms of the South China Sea or other contested waters here in the region. Would you have any comments on that? What would Washington's play be in terms of balancing its priorities in the European region, which is happening right now, and of course the very subtle yet nudging push of China when it comes to Southeast Asia? For anybody, Jim or Prashant?
Well, I can start, but if you haven't read Jim's piece, I think he wrote something for, I think it's Channel News Asia, on the impact of Russia's invasion on Ukraine with US commitment in Southeast Asia. It's a very good read, I think, which gets at some of the aspects of your question, Clarice. And I think what I would say generally is if you apply the sort of framework that I mentioned, there's two things in particular that I'd be worried about. One is, what Jim said about, there's only so much bandwidth for an administration. And the reality is that if there's a crisis that's occurring, that's going to get a lot of the focus. And then the issue becomes, if that is the prism through which you're viewing Southeast Asia, some countries are actually going to benefit perhaps, or there might be a wash, or, Singapore, for example, when there was that meeting where Lee Hsien Loong was just here in the United States, there actually was a benefit in the sense that Singapore turned out, it showed how the US-Singapore strategic partnership was regional and global in nature. But there are other countries, Vietnam, for example, they have relationships traditionally with Russia, and there's a reliance there that's not going to change, I think, anytime soon. So navigating those relationships will matter for some countries much more than others. So that sort of threat balance and hierarchy, and of course, the big question in Southeast Asia is, how does this viewed Russia versus China, right? And if you read the National Defense Strategy, it says China is the primary threat, and Russia clearly is below that. But the key issue is that going to be how it is in practice? And we just don't know. It's too early. The second aspect is resourcing, which is if you look at the defense budget, it's true what the Biden administration said that there was a net increase from last year. But if you do the math and you balance it, account for inflation, the projections on inflation were fairly favorable. And if you take the fact that you might see higher levels of inflation going into 2023, it doesn't look very good for a defense budget where the United States is already trying to plan for so many different contingencies. And so that's where I think the issues would be in terms of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks, Prashant.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, it's quite remarkable that countries like Singapore and Switzerland and Sweden that have historically not taken positions in issues like invasion of other country are now so strongly coming out, and Singapore is applying sanctions. That's quite remarkable. Sweden, famously neutral in World War II, is talking about joining NATO. Why is this? 2,400 years ago, Thucydides talked about the mighty do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. It's only really since World War II when we have a global order where rules matter and everyone's supposed to abide by the rules, that smaller countries could feel some assurance that there wouldn't be these actors outside the norm. Well, now it's thrown outside the window. And this is partially because of things like South China Sea, partially because of, frankly, US invasion of Iraq, but especially because of Ukraine. So now if you're in a Southeast Asian country, what do you do if this is the new rule, which is there are no rules? I would argue if you're Thailand and the Philippines and therefore US allies, and you listen to Joe Biden say repeatedly, not 1 inch of NATO is going to be allowed to be given up to Russia. That's the alliance system. But if you have no allies, what will the US do? Well, if Ukraine's an example, we'll help from the sidelines. So I think countries have to think about what this new world looks like and how they're going to respond.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Prashant. We actually have a very interesting question from the audience. From recent events again. In the past week, there have been announcements of the Solomon Islands drafting a security agreement with China, in part due to the US and regional partners' lack of attention and commitment. Are there countries in the Southeast Asian region vulnerable to these kinds of threats? The question particularly asks something about Thailand's vulnerability, given its drift from the West. Prashant?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, it's a fascinating question because I think it gets at this the issue of one of the questions that I get on the book is, this is all well and good in terms of a balance of commitment framework for U.S. policy, but how does this apply to other powers and their commitment to Southeast Asia and other regions? I think it's an excellent question, and I think when you look at China, this distinction, at least for me personally, that we had maybe 15, 20 years ago about, hey, China is an economic power and the US is a security power. And, it's sort of two Asias, right? My sense is we're really past that. I don't think China is thinking only economically. And if you look at the history of great powers over time, everybody says they're just an economic power, they're not a security power, including the United States, and then they become a security power eventually. That's how power is usually distributed in the system, and I think we're already seeing that with China. We saw that, with the Solomon Islands, we're still waiting on that, but look at Cambodia, right, where we went from potential Chinese basing to essentially we're moving closer and closer to that actually becoming a reality. And the US government has, disclosed publicly the discussions that have been going on. But it's not just actually Cambodia. I mean, China has been conducting Mekong River patrols in that sub-region for a long time. And they publicly advertise that. They're very proud about the fact that they have that mechanism. Even if you look at Southeast Asia, I mean, China is selling military equipment not only to Malaysia, they're selling submarines to Thailand. They're not really making a lot of headway, and there's huge issues that they still have to overcome. But I think, if you were to ask me 10 or 15 years ago, would all of these things be happening? I think some people would have laughed you out of the room, but they're all happening now. In fact, China still, with the Philippines, has a pending Coast Guard agreement and mechanism that they're using and utilizing. It may not necessarily say much about the maturity of the relationship, but I think there's only so many mechanisms that we can keep dismissing before we acknowledge the reality that China is slowly inching towards more of a security role in the region and sort of saying, we're a big economic power, so you have to give more on security. I mean, they definitely make that connection quite explicitly.
Jim, would you have any
Just
comments
to
on
talk
that?
about, yeah, just about the Solomon Islands specifically. It is a rather unique situation with two of the islands having very different viewpoints about China, about Chinese investment being promised, but only with protection from Chinese entities, and frankly, from really, really impressive corruption of Solomon Islands politicians. So you get those factors all together. I'm not sure they all exist in other countries, at least not to that extent. But it's a reminder that when you combine economic power, political power, and basically a belief that democracy is inherently less stable and corruptible, this is what the Chinese see.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Prashant. A couple of questions about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. How different is the Biden's Indo-Pac strategy with the Trump administrations? Are there stark differences, or it's more of how the Biden administration is responding to, again, current events, still patterning itself to the framework it built with the Indo-Pac strategy that it had?
I would say it's still, as I said, the Biden administration is still sort of forming its notion of what its Indo-Pacific approach is. But if you read the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think the big distinction for me, at least, is there's a commitment to working with allies and partners in a way that is much more coordinated. There's a greater focus on a mix of multilateral and minilateral institutions in a way that's much more balanced, including a recognition of ASEAN, even though it's not what we saw under the Obama administration, in part due to ASEAN's, I think, own challenges. And I would say there is a greater recognition of a partner-like economic framework that moves the United States not back to CPTPP anytime soon, I think. But I think U.S. policymakers recognize that it's almost like climbing up a ladder. So the third, sort of the rung that you start with is perhaps a framework where you work on certain sectoral issues like climate and infrastructure. Then you build up maybe to a little bit of market access, and then maybe you build up a little bit to arrangements. I think that is much clearer. Where I think what remains to be seen, I think folks were hoping for a bit of a normalization and predictability and stability on US-China policy. And I don't think we've seen that yet. And I think the Biden administration is still working through that.
Yeah, not much to add. I think the key point is working with partners and allies as opposed to asking what partners and allies can do for the U.S. is the biggest difference.
Okay, just going back to the questions being lodged in our Q&A function, we have a question about how are the U.S. sanctions on Russia impacting the China-Russia relationship? Any comments on that? I've also seen that these economic sanctions, China has been on a neutrality side, again, giving the European region mostly and the US a bit of a panic because, again, China has been a very strategic partner for Russia.
Well, I think with Sino-Russian relations and U.S. perceptions of it, I think we have seen, historically speaking, like a really wide spectrum of views swinging in sort of different directions. And I think, towards, parts of the Cold War, the United States and some U.S. strategic thinkers saw Russia and China actually being very, very close, if not interchangeable, in spite of the fact that there were massive differences between them. And then you had the sort of Sino-Soviet split. And then since the end of the Cold War, I think folks have been a little bit skeptical of this idea that these two countries can come together. And I think what we're seeing is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the big risk, I think, for countries in the region is that it's very difficult to think about Russia and China as different actors. If you have a sort of intensification of a process where China becomes the junior partner of Russia, then it's a very different proposition. You have to think about where you're sourcing your arms from, right? This is countries not only in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, Indonesia, even though Indonesia is moving a little bit away from Russian arms and they've been a little bit more diversified, but also India, for example, right? When you have security concerns with China and you have Russia taking a junior position in the Sino-Russian relationship, that's a very different proposition. And the other one is one of Russia's own role in Southeast Asia. I think, the Russians were trying, you could say this is rhetoric and you dismiss it. Over the past few years, there was actually an effort to say, no, actually our role in Southeast Asia and Asia is actually beyond arms. We want to invest diplomatically. We want to actually, increase our ties with US Treaty allies, including the Philippines. And Thailand. We want to sort of, have a series of linkages with Southeast Asia as a whole. I suspect that now that's going to be very difficult for Russia to do. And so that narrowing of Russia's own presence in Southeast Asia and the region is something that, I think I'm watching very carefully, because we've certainly seen a big diplomatic offensive by the Russians over the past few years to sort of say, hey, we're also pivoting to Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific.
Jim, any comments?
Russia is a huge producer of natural resources and China is a huge consumer of such. And China's always been concerned about somehow being cut off from its supply. Well, the sanctions being imposed on Russia remind China that they could potentially be vulnerable to sanctions. But with Russia, with which they share a huge land border, providing oil, gas, iron ore, whatever is needed to keep that aspect of the Chinese economy going, that's very attractive, I think, to China. Furthermore, China can act to some degree as Russia's banker and switch perhaps from paying for things in dollars and paying with renminbi. So this could be a long-lasting relationship from an economic standpoint. And of course, both are opposed to US approach to the global system.
Thanks, Jim. I'll be capping off with two more questions. You both mentioned earlier how China's role is turning more into a security state. But then given the varying levels of development here in Southeast Asia, and of course, we're coming out of a COVID-19 pandemic, everyone's recovering their economic activities from it. How do you think the Southeast Asian states could respond to US in terms of economic needs, given that, of course, China is usually regarded as an economic power before it's regarded as a security power. Given that China has that better option of providing economic support. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good question because I think in the context of COVID recovery, countries are going to be thinking about their immediate needs, right? So it's all well and good to talk about like high standards, but if countries are facing immediate issues for vaccines, if countries are looking for cheaper infrastructure projects, it's difficult to push that high standards agenda, and you almost have to be flexible. And the United States, I think, not just by itself, but working with other allies and partners, and moving beyond sort of the usual like-minded partners in Southeast Asia as well is going to be really important. I think where it's really interesting in particular is the lesser developed countries, for example, in mainland Southeast Asia, countries like Laos and Cambodia, where the US legacy in the sort of Vietnam War and sort of that period, is still a huge issue, but these countries are burdened with a lot of very basic economic conditions. What the United States, can do there is actually limited, given sort of the other roles like Japan, for example, other players in the region, South Korea, for example. But the United States can help set the table, right? I mean, the perfect example is the Mekong. The United States has gotten much more involved in the Mekong than it was even sort of 20, 25 years ago, and brought together other countries to promote economic development in that regard. So I think there is room for that in terms of COVID recovery. But on the other hand, I mean, what I like to say is the United States is not competing with the worst version of itself. It's competing with China. And China has a lot of hands that it can play too. China joining digital agreements, joining the CPTPP, that may not happen, and they may just be taking credit rhetorically for something. But if they do, that's a huge game changer. They have a lot of economic sort of advantages already. The center of gravity, the geographical advantages. You can build infrastructure projects from Laos to China. You can't build that from Laos to Washington, D.C., right? It's just a reality. The United States can't compete symmetrically economically with China, but that asymmetric competition, I think, is where the competition really lies.
Just for COVID recovery, we've already seen the supply chain problems that COVID created. And now there's a continuing move for companies to remove at least part of their supply chain out of China, rather than having it so concentrated in one country. And this, of course, is a huge opportunity for Southeast Asia that's being taken advantage of, especially by Vietnam and Thailand, I would say. What would be ideal to me is if ASEAN countries as a whole negotiate with Washington to find out, well, what do we need to do in ASEAN to attract more of that investment out of China, come to us, and have us better integrated into the US and Western supply chain.
Thanks, Jim and Prashant. For my last question, just going back to the Philippines, of course, our national elections will be happening next month. And I think you both are very aware of how the Duterte administration changed its foreign policy to be a bit more pro-China. So if in the event the next president of the Philippines takes the same stance, given the policy direction right now of the Biden administration, how do you think the Biden administration will be approaching that new administration of the Philippines in case its foreign policy is still friendly to China?
Just quickly, I mean, I think the Duterte administration has actually been an interesting. I mean, if you just step back from the sort of day-to-day and the policy implications, it's been an actually interesting test case as to, you have a Philippine president who's trying to make this huge shift in foreign policy. What is the net effect on the U.S. alliance, right? And it's a treaty alliance as well. And I think what you've seen is there's a lot of resistance to what a president can do even in that regard. The sort of check of public opinion, the check of the institutional structures, the Philippine military, the Philippine elite establishment, and also the huge people-to-people linkages between the United States and the Philippines that really go beyond the security and trade and economic dimension. At the same time, I will say, with respect to Thailand and a few other countries in Southeast Asia, as I was saying before, China is making gains incrementally, right? So there's only so far you can dismiss what China is doing. So the fact that they have a sort of Coast Guard agreement with the Philippines that they didn't a few years ago, the fact that economically they're doing a lot more. There's a lot of actually Chinese illicit activities that have increased in the Philippines over the past few years than there was the case pre-Duterte, and that has social implications as well. These things don't go away in that regard. And there's also the question of, it's very hard to quantify, but what is the unrealized cooperation in the US-Philippine alliance? So it's not just that things are, what can you do or can't do? It's, how would EDCA have been operationalized if it was under a different president? Could have made a lot more inroads. The Balikatan exercises, a few years ago, the Obama administration was talking about multilateralizing it, the way they did with Cobra Gold. We have seen a inching of that, but it's not really at the pace that it was. So I would say that unrealized cooperation dynamic, if you have another president like that, that's really going to be a huge lost series of opportunities for the alliance.
Jim, would you have any comments on that?
I think Prasant put it perfectly, actually.
All right, thank you. And before we end today's event, thank you again to Jim and Prashant. Prashant, I would like to give you the floor to promote your book, and if it's available here in Asia, the Philippines, or wherever.
Well, thanks a lot, Clarice, and thank you everyone for joining the discussion, and thank you again to Stratbase for hosting this. So the book's available on Amazon, and I'm actually going to be doing a number of other book events, I hope, including in the region in person, hopefully, if we have the easing of pandemic restrictions continue. So I look forward, hopefully, to seeing some of you in Southeast Asia and hopefully in the Philippines towards the end of the year as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Prashant, and thanks everyone. Thank you everyone for attending the book launch event. So, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. And thanks, Jim, for joining.